Did this tent with a near cult-like following live up to the hype, or was it an utter disappointment? Hey everyone, Ghostmo here, and happy welcome to fall. If you're like me, hopefully you're probably enjoying some cooler weather, cozier clothes, good coffee, and a chance to reflect on the season that has come before, and if you're really lucky, planning out a few new great trips for the fall. Now, of course, the onset of fall has another special meaning to the Everyday Backpacker channel, as well as the greater outdoor backpacking YouTube community, and that is end of season gear reviews. Now, I have several really anticipated gear reviews planned for the next few weeks, but most definitely the most anticipated one, and the one people have been waiting for the longest, has been my review of the X-Mid 2 by Durston Gear Company. So to get back into the camping spirit, I went ahead and brewed myself up some CS coffee, my favorite in-camp instant coffee. So let's get started. So how do I know that this is the most anticipated gear review for me to do? Well, frankly, the first video I put out when I first got the tent back in the spring of last year, that video currently sitting at 20,000 views. My entire channel in almost 5 years of being out has 108,000 views. So that one video counts for almost a quarter of the entire views of my channel. That's pretty nuts. And of course the other way I know is that I'm still regularly getting comments of people asking me what I thought of the tent. So here goes. Now I'm not going to go into too many specifics on this tent. One, I already did that in my earlier video, and two, there are now literally thousands of reviews of this tent available online, and so you can definitely get that information. I do want to make a little bit of a distinction about which tent I'm actually reviewing on this video. Now the tent that I'm reviewing is the X-Mid 2, not to be confused with the X-Mid 2 Pro. The X-Mid 2 is a sill poly double wall design that comes in at just a little over 2 pounds. The X-Mid 2 Pro, on the other hand, is a DCF tent, a single wall design, and it comes in at just over 1 pound. The reason I went with the X-Mid 2 was mainly the X-Mid 2 retails at about $300, whereas the X-Mid Pro comes in at just over $600, actually closer to $680. And as much as I would have loved to have gotten that tent, I simply couldn't have afforded it. I went with the X-Mid 2 sill poly design. Now I also went into a lot of detail as to why I made a decision to go with this particular tent in my first video, so if you're curious about that, I definitely encourage you going back and watching that one again. Although based on the view count, most of you probably already have. So this summer I didn't get out on as many trips as I had hoped to, but I still got to go out on at least 3 decent trips, and all 3 of those trips I did use this tent. And so of course the question is, how did those trips go? How did the tent perform? And at the end of the day, am I a lover or hater of the Sage Durston? So for the first trip outing, for my first outdoor pitches of the tent, I and Hot Pants went to a non-disclosed location that was in the rain shadow of the Beartooth Mountains, and that area was a little bit arid, and as it turned out had some pretty sandy soil, which unfortunately for yours truly did cause some issues with setting up the tent. Now in my defense, when I decided to take that tent out on that trip, the original area that I had intended to camp did have relatively hard soils. However, as often happens on the trail, we ended up not camping in that area, and we camped in a different area that had incredibly more sandy soil. And normally that's not a big issue, but being this was a trekking pole tent and it's a tension tent, that puts a lot more tension onto the stakes. And unfortunately, the stakes I had were a little bit too small for the tent, for the soil that we were using, and this caused some issues while I was setting it up. I had several stakes blow out on me, and it became pretty frustrating. And frankly speaking, the other reason why it was a little bit frustrating is I frankly did not practice enough at home before taking this tent on a trip. I fell back onto my laurels, not thinking about that I had never set up a tent pole tent before in the wilderness, and B, have set up the same tent for the last 5 years in a row and was really used to it. And so I did have some practice issues and some sequencing issues that I needed to work out. So it was a pretty tough setup for the first go around. Now at this point, it's important for me to point out that all of the issues I had with this first pitch, none of them had anything to do with the tent itself. They were all because of yours truly. I made some poor decisions, and it struggled. However, I do have to point out that ultimately it was successful. The tent stayed up, and it withstood some pretty decent winds without falling down. Sure, it wasn't quite as taut as I would have liked, but again, it was under less than ideal circumstances. If I was going to be going to that location again, I probably wouldn't take a tension type tent. I would take something that's a little bit more freestanding where there's less tension on the stakes. But all in all, everything worked out for the best. And it was a great trip. The next trip we went on was definitely a healing process for my involvement with this tent in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, this trip also was the one we had a lot of issues with. With weather, we had snowed out, we had to set up emergency camp in a less than ideal place. Again, none of these were any issue with the tent, but it did present some interesting issues that I felt really helped me grow in my familiarity with this tent. So the first night of setting up a tent on this particular trip was the night that we got snowed out. And we had to set up in pretty much the only campsite that we could find. And it was plenty of room for Hot Pants' considerably smaller tent, but I was a little bit concerned with the overall footprint of the Durston and how it was going to fit. I found an area, and it fit relatively well into that area. There were a little bit of issues because that particular spot had several pieces of wood surrounding it that I couldn't get moved, and so I had to mess around a little bit with the tent stakes. But this time I had larger tent stakes with me, which held a little bit better, and overall the setup was a little bit tricky, but went a whole lot better than the first time I tried it. Now again, things weren't under ideal circumstances because frankly we were haggard at the end of the day, and we were setting up in an area that I normally wouldn't have set up a tent site in. But all in all, everything worked out great. And frankly, one of the best nights of sleep I ever had was in that night on that tent. It ended up being a perfect spot. The pitch ended up being really good, and I got my first glimpse of really how comfortable that tent could be. Now, the third and final trip of this particular season was where I really ultimately, spoiler alert, fell in love with the Durston X-Mid. We were out for 3 nights. We had really great pitches. I definitely had my ability to set it up dialed in, and everything went perfectly. Some of the most comfortable sleep I've ever gotten, even on that same trip. With other tents, I've done this trip multiple times, and oh man, the X-Mid, it definitely performed great. So it was definitely a season progression, but in the end, I think you can probably tell by now, spoiler alert again, yep, I'm an X-Mid Sage lover. Alright, so with the trip reviews out of the way, what were my likes and what were my dislikes of the tent? Because there were some of both. So let's get started with that. Ultimately, the thing that I love the most about this tent is the space you have inside of this tent. It is, in comparison to my previous tent, just gargantuan. It's so easy to get situated in there, to get comfortable. You know, I was really concerned initially with the offset trapezoidal design of the floor that it would be really tough to get an idea of where the flat area was. And I don't know if I just had extraordinarily good luck, but almost all my pitches, I felt way more flat than previous years. There were a few that I misguided a little bit or didn't have the opportunity to get as perfectly flat, but generally speaking, great nights of sleep, and I was really able to stretch out, and on the few occasions where we had rain at night or condensation in the tent, which I'll talk about later, I didn't have any issues with my sleeping bag getting anywhere close to those walls and causing condensation to build up on my down sleeping bag. So the space in this thing is just unmatched. Also, the vestibule size on these things was perfect. I was able to get in and out of the tent without having any issues. I didn't have any condensation transfer on the one night that we did have condensation. I was able to very easily store my gear in the vestibules, as well as some of my gear inside of the tent that I wanted a little bit more protected, because there's so much room. It definitely would easily hold 2 people, but for me, it was just like a mansion for me out there by myself. And then there were a couple design features that I absolutely fell in love with. One being the magnetic door closure on the fly, as well as the very easy to just overhand tie knot the actual mesh door to get it out of the way in order to be able to use anything. And of course, the the best thing about the tent is the offset poles that just don't get in the way. Once that tent's up, I don't even think about the poles. They're not in the middle of the door. They're off to the side. I didn't run into them at all. And the whole tent just, it works great. One of the surprising design features that I didn't think too much about before I set it up was the fact that the guy lines adjustment is actually at the peak instead of the bottom like most of them are. And the reason I like that is it doesn't put undue tension onto the stake, and then it makes it a lot easier to be able to cantilever the poles to be able to get a really nice taunt pitch. So it seems like a really small thing, a thing that I didn't even think about, but I really do like that the guy line tensioners are at the tent peak as opposed to the bottom of the line. Another thing I was concerned about with this being a trekking pole tent was how well it was going to do in the wind as far as stability. I have to say again, I was pleasantly surprised by this and happy with the performance. Even under a bad pitch, that as in that first night, we still had quite considerable winds early in the evening and the tent still stayed up just fine. And that was under less than ideal conditions. The real big test was the storm that we had go through on the first night of the Sundance trip. And I have to say that I was awake throughout most of it because I had never been in a trekking pole tent in a storm before, and I definitely was wondering how it was going to perform with the wind kicked up. And other than, you know, your typical fluttering of the fabric and stuff, it didn't move at all. It was super solid, and at no point did I feel like the tent was in danger of falling down. The guy lines worked great. The design of it, the sloping of the walls, it definitely made it very stable. So all in all, it definitely held its own against the wind. And lastly, I was really impressed by the tent's handling of condensation. Now, even though it is a double wall tent, there was still some condensation. Really only one day did I have any major condensation, which was on the first night, which we were relatively close to water. And again, there were some storms going through. So there were definitely some some conditions that created a little bit of condensation. I was tearing the tent down and multiple times pushed the mesh into the tent wall, and I didn't even think there was condensation at first because nothing came through the mesh, surprisingly. So I didn't have any issues with contact with the condensation and didn't even really notice it until I started taking the tent down. And it was relatively minimal, and at no point did any of that condensation end up inside the actual body of the tent. Everything I had stayed dry, so it didn't generate a lot of condensation, and what condensation it did generate stayed on the fly and did not transfer over into me or my stuff. Alright, and lastly, what are some things that I didn't like about the tent? Because let's face it, nothing is perfect. Although I have to say that I actually kind of struggled to find some things that I disliked about this tent, but I was able to come up with a few. The first one, not only was a positive, but also is a concern, is its large size definitely creates a large footprint. And there are definitely some places that I've camped in the past that I feel like this tent I would have struggled to get it set up inside of that area. So in a lot of sense, even though the smaller tents are like being in a coffin, they definitely have a lot more flexibility in where they can go. So this tent, being a very large square shape on the bottom, definitely takes up a lot of real estate. Now, another issue that I had with this tent was the tent stakes it comes with. And I'm sorry, Dan, the tents you make are awesome, but the stakes, they unfortunately have a little bit desired, in my opinion, and just my opinion. So what I did was I replaced these initially with some different stakes. The first stakes that I replaced them with were the MSR Groundhog Minis. Now these will work really well if you have really solid soil, but unfortunately, as I found out on my first trip, they just weren't big enough to hold. And then also, even on the second trip, I had some issues with them kind of trying to weasel their way out of some relatively soft ground. So I ended up replacing even the miniature ones with the full-size groundhogs, and these stakes definitely did the job. Unfortunately, they're not the cheapest things in the world, but they definitely do the job really well. And although I would say on a freestanding tent, you don't need as big of a stake generally, with a tension tent, I think it is better to have a little bit more bite, and it's going to stay in the ground a whole lot better. So ultimately, I did replace all of the stakes with the groundhog minis. With the regular size groundhogs. Again, a little bit of a weight penalty, but definitely worth it in the end. And lastly, the only other thing that I really didn't like about the tent was constantly clipping and unclipping the little clips on the corners at the bottom that hold the body and the footprint in place. especially in the morning when my hands are really cold. Those little clips are really kind of tough to manipulate. Now, I do have a little bit of an embarrassment associated with this, because when I first bought this tent, my good buddy Jim from Lost at Gaming with Jim told me that it was a lot easier to leave the body and the of the tent clipped into the fly and just set it all up as one big unit. Did I listen to him? No, of course not, because I like making my life harder. And so after several nights of setting up and taking down the tent, I definitely realized he was 100% right. It is a lot easier to leave those things connected and just set it up as one unit. So moving forward, I will definitely be listening to my friend, which I should have done at the beginning, because he clearly is a lot smarter at this than I am. And we'll be leaving my tent body clipped into my tent fly when I'm out on the trip, to make it a lot easier to set up and not having to mess with those little plastic clips, which do their job well but are kind of a pain in the butt in the morning. So at the end of the day, the question is going to be, did my dislikes outweigh my likes? And quite frankly, not even close. I absolutely love this tent, and I do think it lives up to the hype, at least for me and my needs. It performed far better than I could ever hope for, and I'm definitely excited to continue to use this tent in the future. I still have other tents to be able to use for different trips, because I will admit that I don't think that this is a perfect tent for every situation. Again, like I said, areas I know where tent sites are going to be smaller, or places that have really sandy soils, probably not going to be my go-to. But for all other trails, I think this tent is definitely worth the hype. So all in all, I'm definitely going to give this tent 4 out of 5 stars. Because although I really definitely love this tent, I would say it didn't perform perfectly. Now I do have to give a little bit of caveat again, that some of those issues were my issues and not necessarily an issue with the design of the tent. But I could see where that combination of things could cause problems in future trips. So again, not a perfect 5-star, but pretty darn close. And there you have it. The long-awaited, much anticipated post-season review of the Durston X-Mid 2. Next, we'll have a review of my Waymark Light 50-liter pack. And I'm not going to spoil it now, but there is a little bit of an Easter egg in the background of my video that refers to another piece of equipment that I'm going to do a first-time review after the pack review is finished. I hope you guys had a great season. I hope you're looking forward to a great fall season and enjoy some of that fall weather. And as always, keep hiking on.